A senator is calling for RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki to resign after what she said in interviews with various media outlets last week. Commissioner Brenda Lucki initially told reporters she was, quote, struggling to define the term systemic racism. Days later, though, she responded and said systemic racism exists in the RCMP through a written statement. The discussion was prompted originally by the death of George Floyd in the U.S., but it grew much louder following incidents between police and Indigenous people in this country. In the last 9 days, police in New Brunswick have shot and killed 2 Indigenous people. 26-year-old Chantal Moore, who police were doing a wellness check on, and 48-year-old Rodney Levi, where RCMP responded to a call about what they say was an unwanted person near a home last Friday. Would a change at the top mean change in the entire RCMP ranks could happen? Lillian Dyck is the Saskatchewan senator calling on Commissioner Lucki to resign. She's in Saskatoon this evening. Marion Buller chaired the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She joins us from Vancouver. Hello to both of you. Real pleasure to welcome you to the program.
Good afternoon.
Senator, I'm going to begin with you. Why did you feel compelled to come out today and call for either Commissioner Lucki to be removed or to resign?
Well, after I'd heard her comments about systemic racism, and at first she said she didn't really know what it was, and then she flipped completely around and said that she should have said she knew and that there was systemic racism. It was just too much, because I think the person who is leading the RCMP has to know what systemic racism is in order to eliminate it and change it. It's been 2 years since she's had the job, and it's just unbelievable to me that she really doesn't seem to understand what systemic racism is, and particularly with regard to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, where she pledged that they would do their best, and this definitely is not the best.
Yeah, you cited in your statement today, your press release today, 2 years ago at one of the hearings of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Commissioner Lucki apologized for the way we were treated by the RCMP. She promised that, quote, we, meaning the RCMP, will do better. Ms. Buller, former Commissioner Buller, I do want to bring you in on that point. How did you feel when you heard Commissioner Lucki's original statements and then the statement that she put out a few days later acknowledging that systemic racism does exist?
Well, first of all, I was grateful that she was so honest, to her detriment, about not being entirely clear on what systemic racism is, or the definition. And we have to thank Senator Sinclair for clarifying and making sure we all understand what the definition of systemic racism is, because a lot of people were using the terminology incorrectly, in my view. So thanks to Senator Sinclair. So moving ahead, I'm glad to now know that Commissioner Lucki has a clear understanding of what is meant by systemic racism and is prepared to address systemic racism within the ranks of the RCMP.
Do you think, Ms. Buller, that it is possible, I guess Senator Dyck's point, and we'll ask her about it again in a second, more about it in a second, is that if you don't understand the term, it's difficult to rectify the actual problem. Do you agree with that, or do you think that Commissioner Lucki can now, I guess, usher in that change?
I would agree entirely with Senator Dyck. Had Commissioner Lucki not understood what systemic racism meant and changed her position with respect to systemic racism within the RCMP. I suppose it's really up to the Prime Minister as to whether or not she can lead.
Senator, let me get you in on that same point. And I just want to read a section of the statement that Commissioner Lucki issued on Friday. She had said in interviews, including with my colleague Rosemary Barton, that she thought she told Rosemary 15 to 20 various definitions of it. I shared that I struggled with the definition of systemic racism while trying to highlight the great work done by the overwhelming majority of our employees. I did acknowledge that we, like others, have racism in our organization, but I did not say definitively that systemic racism exists in the RCMP. I should have. Did that alter at all, how you view the possibility for change, or you think it came too late?
I think it was too little too late. As I said before, she's been in the job for 2 years. She should have had a good understanding when she started the job, and 2 years down the road, suddenly she's seen the light as to what it is. Frankly, someone has to take responsibility, and she's a person responsible. Who has she put in charge? What has she done with regard to the recommendations in the National Inquiry Report, who laid out very clearly in the calls to justice that systemic racism was one of the root causes, and actually gave points as to what could be done. So I am just frustrated and appalled that Commissioner Lucki, 2 years down the road, just can't seem to get the answer straight about concerning systemic racism. And thank goodness Senator Sinclair pointed out to her and to the rest of Canada what it is really all about.
Senator, what is your message for the government, who ultimately were tasked with implementing those recommendations? They were to have come up with a national plan of action based on the recommendations, which they delayed and described because it was because of COVID. I've spoken to Ms. Buller before about that, and if I put it, I hope accurately, she didn't buy that, just given some of the technology that's available right now. What is your message for the government on this issue tonight?
Well, of course, we know that the government has not come up with their own national action plan, that has been delayed. They had about 9 months to come up with something. They haven't communicated to us what kind of plans they're coming up with. And it's discouraging to hear some of the Prime Minister and not all the ministers say, well, we're willing to work with her. We're willing to let her learn what systemic racism while she's on the job. Well, that's not good enough. She promised to do the best for our communities. And what's happening? We don't have a person who can give us the best for our communities, who can actually change what's going on in the RCMP so that our women and girls are actually protected. We rely upon the RCMP and the police to protect us. And at this point in time, that's not happening. And I don't see it happening under leadership that has not got the knowledge or the skills or the, setting the right tone to say there shall be zero tolerance for racism in the RCMP, and here's what we need to do to change it. There needs to be somebody who has the courage and the strength to stand up and actually do it.
Ms. Buller, could you describe for us or highlight for us some of what, in the audience, the inquiry you and your colleagues, the other commissioners, were able to find out about the presence of racism in the RCMP, and what you think some of the actual actionable things that could be done going forward are?
In the course of our work, we heard from families and survivors all across Canada about lack of action on the part of the police when they made a report about a missing loved one or a murdered loved one, for that matter. They also told us about being taken into custody on outstanding warrants when they were actually wanting the police to help them with, say, a domestic violence issue. We heard of a whole variety of complaints about the way the RCMP and other police forces, I should add, have been treating them over the years and their lost loved ones. It was very easy for us to make a finding of systemic racism, especially with the RCMP, and especially when you look at how and why the RCMP and its predecessor, the Northwest Mounted Police, started in Canada and what their purpose was. And I'll just briefly add, it was to clear the prairies so that settlers could come and claim Indian land as theirs and farm it, and to basically get the Indians out of the way of the white settlers. So that's the beginning of the Northwest Mounted Police. So when we looked at all those factors, the historical basis upon which the RCMP was built, the ongoing complaints of inadvertence, of racism, of lack of understanding, lack of training, it was very easy to make these findings of systemic racism. Of course, our recommendations, our calls for justice included increased training, cultural training, not only at Depot in Regina, but ongoing training on the ground, because what we heard was what happens at depot, what you're told at depot, and then what your field trainer and other people tell you is how to do it when you're actually on the job, on the ground, can be two entirely different things. So we talked about follow-up training. We also talked about the difficulties the RCMP policy for rotation through hardship postings creates for local communities. Vashti, I could go on for hours and I won't, but we certainly did identify systemic racism and ways of addressing that racism.
I do very much appreciate both of you making time for the program this evening and for your insights this evening as well. Thank you so much to Marion Buller and Senator Lillian Dyck.